The other day, somebody I know posted a link to a news article on Facebook, and it was about these young people having these COVID parties. And they weren't just having parties despite the fear of COVID-19. They were actually pooling money into a collection, and then they'd have the party with no spacing or anything like that, no masks. And then if somebody got COVID, they would win the pool. Sort of a reverse of the old Italian Ponzi insurance schemes, where everybody would chip in money, and whoever was the last to survive when everybody else died, you got the money. Sort of reverse life insurance. Uh, and my first thought was along the lines of the story, what a bunch of idiots. And I was starting to respond, and I was going to make some sort of crack about they've been eating too many Tide Pods. But then something popped into the back of my head that I had really forgotten. I think I was probably about 8 years old, and I was into Cub Scouts, and my mother was our den mother, and I came down with one of the various childhood diseases. I don't remember which one it was. Measles, mumps, German measles, chicken pox, one of those. And I think it was like a Saturday. I came home from school sick on Friday. So my mother called all the other kids in our Cub Scout den, called their mothers, and told them that the meeting, which was on like Monday or Tuesday, I forget what night we had our den meetings, would be canceled because I was sick. And they all said, fine. And that was pretty much that. But then later in the day, they started calling her. And basically, what they wanted was to send their kids over, and which they did. And on Sunday, my mother made lunch for everybody. I remember I felt like crap. And all the kids were over there, and we had a little party. And sure enough, by the end of the week, they were all sick. Now, why did they do that? They did it because in those days, and remember, I was born in 1951. This is before all the vaccines. They didn't have these shots that you get now to protect you from this. They didn't even have polio vaccines yet. The only thing we had was the smallpox vaccine. So you wanted your kids to get these diseases before they reach puberty, because at least the common perception was, and I think it's true scientifically, that you're better off catching something like chickenpox or measles or German measles, or especially mumps, which affects the glands, when you're before puberty rather than after puberty. It could do more damage to you, and you would get sicker, and it could cause other problems. So you wanted your kids to get these things before they reached a certain age, so that it wasn't infrequent, as was the case with my Cub Scout den. When one kid would get sick, you'd send your kids over to play with it. Get sick, get it out of the way so you didn't have to worry about it. There was a real danger that if you held your kid out and avoided all these things, and then they hit puberty, and then they got it, it would be a lot worse. So you actually wanted your kids to get sick earlier. So rather than locking things down, you actually tried to send your kids into a situation where they would get sick. And when we went to school, we didn't wear masks. There was no social distancing. I went to a Catholic school in Philadelphia. I mean, we had 50 to a class. I mean, we were just jammed together in those classrooms, much larger class sizes than they had in public school. Now, I think the common perception is that these childhood diseases pose no threat to anybody. But that's not true. I went back in, and I've looked at the literature online, and most of them, it varied from study to study and time to time, but most of these childhood diseases, measles, mumps, chickenpox, German measles, rubella, had about 0.2% chance of being fatal. So if I had measles and everybody sent their kids over, they were running risks with that child. The child could, in fact, die. And not many people did, but it was 0.2%. If you add up all those diseases, I know that's not how statistics works, but still, if you take all these childhood diseases and you lump them together, you're running around, a 1% chance. Of course, the childhood disease that was really scary was polio. And we were all familiar with polio. We had our annual March of Dimes thing. We'd go out and try to collect dimes from family and friends, and it's a little book, and you slip the dimes in and you turn it in. I guess it worked. They did come up with a vaccine for polio. But that wasn't until I was maybe 11 or 12. I remember getting the sugar cube polio vaccine, which was, I think, the second one they developed. It's much more easy to deliver. I had friends who had leg braces. I knew there were kids in my school who had leg braces. And one of the scariest stories I ever read was the boy in the iron lung. I was probably in third or fourth grade. And this kid had been paralyzed, not just from the legs, but from the neck down. And they put you in this iron tube with was tight around the neck, and basically it had a pump that would compress your chest to keep you breathing, with the hope that eventually, you'd recover some of your strength, and as patients often did, and they might be able to at least breathe on their own if they never walk again. And to me, this was horrible. I mean, I had nightmares about, I'd wake up in an iron lung. And remember, for most of basically my whole time until the end of elementary school, this was a real fear. And the percentage of people who died who caught polio was about 2.5%. So it was more than 10 times the other childhood diseases. And what did we do? I mean, the story was that you could catch it usually in the summers, usually if you were near water, if you were boating or swimming or at a lake or at a pool. I mean, pools, sometimes they were even closed if there had been an outbreak of polio at a pool. I can still remember that. And yet, when I was a kid, I'd spend the summers, much of the summers, at my grandparents' place in Wildwood Crest, New Jersey, and I'd be at the beach or the bay every day. I'd be out on boats. And if I was back in Philadelphia, I'd go up to the local pool, which was only a couple blocks from my house, Boulevard Pool, which I'm sure is no longer there. And we'd have our season pass, and all my friends and I, we'd get our bikes and we'd ride up the Boulevard Pool, and we'd hang out there all day. And this is despite the fact that there was no vaccine for a virus, polio, that if you caught it, you had about a 2.5% chance of dying. And if you caught it and didn't die, you could be paralyzed. You could end up in an iron lung. Or if you were lucky, you'd only have leg braces on. But we didn't wear masks, we didn't social distance, we didn't shut down the pools. Why is that? Polio isn't a childhood disease like the others. I mean, polio was a real virus, and it was a real problem. And my point here is, the point of the title of this video is we shouldn't have any more lockdowns. Now, whether or not we should have had the original set of lockdowns is another story, and maybe another video. Maybe I'll talk about that someday. The question is, should we have another lockdown now as the cases surge? And my argument is no. I mean, what is the death rate for COVID-19? Well, it depends when you look. When I first started following this, and I follow it because I'm like the poster child for people vulnerable. I'm 68 years old. I had a kidney transplant. I take drugs every day that suppress my immune system. I'm like an advertisement for COVID attack. I was wearing a mask before they were mandatory, and when they were no longer mandatory in my state, I still wore them. So I take this very seriously. That's why I watch things. And when it first broke out, we were told that the mortality rate, if you caught it, was about 15%. And then it was 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. When it got to 8, where I live, they stopped reporting it, which I thought was awfully suspicious. Because they were trying to, this is a real threat. You need to take care. 15% death rate. But when it kept dropping, because the more they tested, the more cases there were, but the number of dead don't change, then the death rate keeps dropping. It's now about 4% around the world, based on what they know. But if you look at the trajectory, it was 15% to start, 16%. Now it's down to 4 in about 3 months. Where will it be in another 3 months? We have these surge of cases right now. All these new cases are coming in. But at least in my state, the number of deaths are usually still in single digits or low double digits. They're not proportionally higher to the jump in new cases. And because of that, what that means inevitably is the death rate, mortality rate for COVID-19 is going to keep dropping. It's 4% today, it's eventually going to hit 3%. How low will it ultimately go? We don't know. I mean, if it's dropped from 15 to 4 in 3 months, will it go from 4 to 1 in another 3 months? So to say that COVID is more deadly than polio, which was roughly 2.5%, we can't say that yet. It may not be. And if you look at the trends in the last 3 months and what's going on today, the suggestion is it probably won't be higher. It's probably going to be as low. I don't know if 2.5 is low, however you want to interpret that, or it may even go lower. We don't know. I don't think it'll ever get to, chickenpox level where it's 0.2%. I'm not arguing that. But polio was, 2.5%. It's a pretty big deal. So if you go back and you look at the period when I was a kid, and you look at the percent of the possibility of death if you caught chickenpox or measles, mumps, rubella. And that's not, then you have, diphtheria and rickets and other things that people used to catch in those days. And you add all that together as a possibility of death. And then you layer on polio at 2.5% and the possibility of being paralyzed, even if you recover. Those are pretty grim statistics. But, the schools were never shut down. We never practiced social distancing. We never wore masks. We didn't lock down the country until they came up with the polio vaccine. They didn't close all the pools every summer. They didn't prevent people from going to the beach or the lakes or swimming or boating until we had a vaccine. We didn't do any of that. Were we stupid? Or are they stupid now? I mean, what was the point of all this? And again, if you look at COVID death rates, which have dropped a lot from 15 to 4 in 3 months, and we don't know where they'll be in another 3 months. What if they go down to 1%, which is the death rate from the flu? I mean, what if it turns out ultimately, and this is not inconceivable, that the death rate of COVID-19 is about the same as the flu, and we lock the whole country down? Now, I'm not predicting that. I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but it could happen if you look at the trends over the last 3 months and you look at the trends today of this explosion of new cases, which is not met by an explosion of higher death rates. So if you look at the situation that we face today, why should, and the death rate for younger people, while it's going up a little, is still much lower than the general population. Why shouldn't we reopen the schools? Why is this a debate? There are a lot of people arguing we should reopen the schools. I mean, is the chance of catching COVID and dying for a 10-year-old today, or the odds of that happening, any greater than the odds I faced when I was 10 years old of dying from chickenpox, measles, German measles, mumps, or polio? The answer is no. We didn't shut down then. Why should we shut down now? The teachers didn't stand in the front of the rooms with masks and plastic separating them from the schoolroom then, but we're going to do it now, or we're going to beam the teachers in remotely, or everything is going to be done online. I mean, science is supposed to look at the numbers and deal with statistics and trends and things like that. But if you look at these things, would we have been better off? Or should we just, take polio. Polio has been around forever. Should we have, Franklin Roosevelt got polio back in the 1920s. Should we have shut the country down till we got a vaccine in the 1960s? Shut the country down for 40 years because of the threat of polio? Or shut it down every summer? That's absurd. What would the country look like today? Probably be run by the Germans and the Japanese, because we would have been shut down and unable to fight World War II. Where do you draw the lines on these things? You can't get rid of all risk. We live in a risk-averse society. We all know that. But how much damage do you want to do? How many people, will die of drug overdoses? I mean, I would bet that the kids today are less likely to have a friend who died of COVID-19 than they are to have a friend who died of a drug overdose. I mean, if I think back to my friends that I grew up with, and we went through all these childhood diseases, and yes, I know one kid who did catch polio. He didn't die, and eventually he even got rid, like Forrest Gump, he got rid of the braces, although he probably has severe health complications today, as did many of those kids have eventually as they got older. And I look at all that, and I look at the odds that we faced. And when I look back at my friends, how many of them died of disease? Okay, one kid caught polio and had to wear leg braces. But most of my friends who died, I remember an instance. I was teaching history at Georgetown, and I had a German student. She asked me if I was from the Vietnam generation. And I said, yeah. She said, oh, it's terrible. How many of your friends died in Vietnam? And I never really thought about it before. And I started thinking, and then I turned on the blackboard and I started writing names. And I wrote the names and another name and another name and another name. And I think I ended up with 8 names. And she was like this, like, you had 8 friends who died in Vietnam? I said, no, I had no friends who died in Vietnam. I said, these are all my friends who died in car or motorcycle accidents related to drug or alcohol abuse. Either they were abusing drugs or alcohol, or they were hit by somebody who was abusing drugs and alcohol. And this was, my 8 friends died over about a 2.5-year period. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, I had a circle of maybe 50 friends, and 8 of them died in 2.5 years. None of them died from disease. None of them died in Vietnam. I had friends who were wounded in Vietnam. I didn't know anybody who were actually killed. But for a while there, my friends were dropping like flies. I mean, it's like you went out on a weekend, you didn't know if you'd come back. I mean, it seemed in about a 30-month period, there were 8 funerals. What's that? It's a funeral every 4 months. I had a friend who was buried. So I mean, it's a dangerous world. And COVID is one more danger. And like I said, I'm not going to make the argument we should have never locked down. That's a separate issue. But should we lock down again? My argument would be no. We didn't lock down for these other things. And I think collectively, all the childhood diseases and polio pose more of a risk to the average, at least young person, than COVID does today. So why shouldn't we reopen the schools? Why should we shut down again? I mean, people like me who are at risk, wear a mask. Stay the hell at home. Don't go out. I go out a lot less. I go out, usually only if I have to. Or I'll go out earlier in the day because if I go somewhere, it'll be less crowded. Play the odds. If you go out and there's very few people there, as opposed to a time you go out and it's jammed, you go when there are fewer people. So instead of going to dinner at dinner time, we go to lunch and have a late dinner. I mean, you can play the odds. If you live in a nursing home, lock those things down, shut them down, and give them extra protection. But for the rest of the population, let the people go out there. Let them make their own decisions. I mean, if we lock down again, it's just going to extend this thing further. I mean, go back and look at the diagrams. Remember when we were going to flatten the curve? You look at when you flatten the curve on those diagrams, you don't cut down on the number of deaths. You squeeze the deaths. First off, you prevent the health system from collapsing, but you squeeze the deaths down the road. You're kicking the can down the road. There's going to be more cases later, but you don't get your healthcare system overwhelmed. But unless the healthcare system is challenged, you shouldn't lock everybody down. I mean, I can understand why they did it in New York. They came close to being overwhelmed, although they didn't get there either. I mean, the hospital ship was barely used. The hospital in Central Park was barely, if ever, used. Where I live, we were never close to overwhelmed, but we were locked down all the same. So in many ways, what the lockdown diagrams predict is what's happening today. More cases today. Because they squeeze them on that diagram, push them down the chronological road, And that's where we're at today. And if we lock down, we're just going to do the same thing. We'll just lower the number of cases now and increase the number of cases down the road. If this thing has to play out on its own. And until it does, it's never going to end. Anyway, if you like this video, you found something in it worthwhile, leave a comment. Please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification button so you know when I post new videos. And until the next time, I am out of here.